My name is Kate McMahon. I'm a planning consultant with the project and will be presenting this webinar. This webinar explains what local officials need to know about statutory requirements in preparing a growth policy. In Montana, the state statutes are called the Montana Code Annotated and are abbreviated as MCA. This webinar is divided into 4 parts based on the following learning objectives. At the end of the webinar, participants should understand what the MCA prerequisites are to undertake a growth policy effort, what content is required by the MCA to be included in a growth policy, the MCA process for adopting, revising, and repealing a growth policy, and the use of the growth policy after adoption as specified by the MCA. Before we move on to the learning objectives, it's important to review the stated purpose in the MCA for preparing a growth policy. Note that the purpose section of the MCA was adopted in 1957. It's interesting to note that the basic planning principles stated in the MCA and highlighted in red are very similar to the planning principles that were adopted 50 years later by HUD, EPA, and the Department of Transportation as part of the Sustainability Partnership. The first objective addresses those steps that must be taken prior to undertaking a growth policy. Step 1 is to establish a planning board. Most jurisdictions have already appointed a planning board, but some smaller towns may need to take this step. As noted in Step 2, the planning board is only an advisory body. Therefore, the MCA requires that the governing body, the City Council or County Commission, provide specific direction to the planning board before they undertake the effort to update a growth policy. The final step should not be overlooked, and that is to establish a planning area around the cities and towns to clarify jurisdictional areas. Planning area is sometimes referred to as the donut or the extraterritorial jurisdiction. The MCA establishes the maximum size of this extraterritorial area. The blue box at the bottom of this slide indicates that maximum area is dependent on how the city is classified in the MCA. The extraterritorial area can be smaller than the maximum area specified in the MCA. In order to determine the size, consider the factors that are listed in the slide, such as population growth, extension of utilities, natural features, or existing development patterns. This part of the webinar covers the MCA requirements for growth policy content. Section 76-1-601 specifies what localities must include in a growth policy. In accordance with this section, the growth policy can be divided into parts. The first part lists the required elements or chapters that must be in a growth policy. The second part includes strategies to implement a growth policy and lists those things that a growth policy must have. The third part of this MCA section lists the optional items that a community might consider in preparing a growth policy. If a community has received a Community Development Block Planning Grant to prepare the growth policy, the Department of Commerce staff will have a checklist to make sure that the growth policies contains all of these required sections. This checklist can be found on the Department of Commerce Community Technical Assistance Program website in the Montana Growth Policy Handbook. And we'll have a website for that at the end of this webinar. In the previous slide, the MCA requires that a growth policy contains 6 elements or chapters. This slide shows the 6 required elements of the MCA: land use, population, housing needs, economic conditions, local services, and natural resources. It is recommended that each required element be treated as a separate chapter and clearly labeled. Also note that the growth policy requires information on sand and gravel resources, but this is not a separate element. That information can be included in one of these elements, such as natural resources or land use. The MCA also specifies what information should be contained in an element. An element must include goals and objectives, an inventory of existing conditions, and a description of trends. As illustrated in this figure, an element is the compilation of all of these components. In reviewing the growth policies from around the region, many of them did not contain all of these required components from the MCA. For example, there was lots of data from the census, but no analysis describing the trend. There might be a description of water and sewer infrastructure, but there was no mention on projected upgrades or expansion to these systems or policies on how they would expand or improve those systems. Such trends should be identified in order to craft the policies that local officials can rely on to make decisions about budget or capital improvements. Likewise, there were often goals and policies in the growth policies, but there was no data documenting the issue. According to the MCA, elements must contain both the data, the trends, and the goals and objectives. In addition to the required elements, the growth policy must contain implementation strategies. In our review of the growth policies in the region, many were missing one or more of these required sections. Some important things to note on this slide. The Montana Growth Policy Handbook has a good description of implementation measures and subdivision requirements. A website where you can download the Montana Growth Policy book, and that's a good resource to help you with your growth policies. The public infrastructure strategy should be labeled as a separate section. Usually in this section, communities will cross-reference their capital improvement plan and also describe funding sources such as grants, tax increment finance districts, or special improvement districts they're going to be using to help them upgrade their infrastructure. It is preferable to have an action plan table that lists the task and target dates and staffing to meet the requirement for having a timetable. The MCA also requires that the growth policy be reviewed every 5 years, and this should be reflected in the section on revising your growth policy. At a minimum, the MCA only requires that intergovernmental section to discuss development review procedures and how these will be coordinated between cities and towns and the county. But the Community Technical Assistance Program, housed at the Montana Department of Commerce, also recommends that this section have a discussion on areas of cooperation with other agencies such as school districts, fire districts, watershed groups. Finally, the requirement for information on wildland fire protection can be met by cross-referencing the Community Wildfire Protection Plan or the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Plan. These documents are typically housed at the county's Department of Emergency Services, so it's recommended that you contact these departments and include a summary of their recommendations in your growth policy. The MCA also describes optional elements that can be included in the growth policy, and these are listed on these slides. These options give the communities the flexibility to address specific needs in their area. For example, many growth policies have a transportation element, even though this specific element is not listed in the MCA. Often a neighborhood plan or study will be completed in a separate process from the original growth policy. If that's the case, then you have to adopt that as an amendment through another public hearing process. This section addresses the learning objective on adopting a growth policy. The adoption process for a growth policy is similar to the process for a zoning or subdivision hearing, where the planning board publishes the legal notice, conducts hearing, and then makes a recommendation to the governing body. The governing body must then officially adopt the growth policy by resolution. Some things about this slide. A public hearing at the city council or county commission meeting is optional. Most communities will have a public hearing at the city council or county commission level, but again, that's an optional requirement. You have to do it at the planning board level, but it's optional at the city, county, or county commission. The governing body can then take the recommendation from the planning board, and they can adopt the growth policy with revisions, but after the growth policy is adopted, any subsequent revisions must go back to the planning board for another public hearing. He also has the option of submitting the growth policy to the electorate for adoption by referendum. This is very rare, and I don't really know of any other cases in Montana where this has happened. Most of the growth policies, or all of the ones that I know of, have been adopted by a resolution from the City Council or the County Commission. The MCA also has a provision for the growth policy to be repealed. Either the governing body can pass a resolution to repeal the growth policy, or again, they can submit it to the voters and have it repealed by referendum. This is very rare, but it actually did happen in Ravalli County about 5 years ago, where they had a vote to repeal the growth policy. The final part of the webinar discusses the MCA provisions for using the growth policy once it has been adopted. Now that you have a growth policy, use it. Don't let it sit on the shelf. Communities must consult the growth policy when rezoning applications. According to the MCA, the layout of utilities and roads in a subdivision and the proposed land uses in a zoning application must be consistent with the growth policy. Typically, the growth policy will include a future land use map, such as the one on this slide, to visually represent the anticipated pattern of development. Goals and policies provide additional direction to help interpret the land use patterns that are on the map, and they should also be consulted. Section 76-1-605 was added to the Montana Code Annotated in 2003 to address a practice by some jurisdictions that were including regulatory standards in their growth policy and then enforcing those were part of a zoning or subdivision code. The chart illustrates the process that should be followed if it's going to be done correctly. The first step is to include the recommended standards in the growth policy. Then once the growth policy is adopted, the code should be amended, either the subdivision, zoning, or building code should be amended to be consistent with the growth policy recommendations. Only after the codes have been amended or those regulations have been adopted, officially adopted as part of the codes, can they be enforced by the locality. For example, the growth policy may recommend a 100-foot stream setback, but unless that requirement is adopted as part of a zoning code or subdivision ordinance, a community cannot deny a permit based solely on growth policy recommendation. Growth policy is not a regulatory document. After the language in 76-1-605 from the previous slide was included in the MCA, some local officials interpreted this to mean that the growth policy was advisory and compliance with the recommendations in the growth policy was optional. It's clearly stated in the MCA, however, that regulations must be made in accordance with the growth policy. In a recent Montana Supreme Court case from Missoula County, the court unequivocally stated that compliance with the growth policy is not optional. Any zoning or subdivision action must comply with the growth policy. There have been a number of zoning cases that have been overturned because the courts determined that the zoning action did not comply with the growth policy. Slide from the Montana Growth Policy Handbook explains if a community wants to take a zoning action that does not comply with the growth policy, they must first amend the growth policy. For example, if a community wants to rezone land for an industrial park for a new business that's coming to the town, and the growth policy land use map shows this land as agriculture, the community must first go back, amend the growth policy to change the land use designation from agriculture to industrial, and then only after that they have to take a second action to amend the zoning ordinance. This section 76-1-607 was added by the legislature in 2013. If a county has a Forest Service land or Bureau of Land Management land, they may want to use the growth policy to establish cooperating or coordinating agency status. If this is the case, the county should consult with the appropriate agency to determine what they want to see in the growth policy and what this coordinating status will mean for them. In conclusion, always read the growth MCA before preparing your growth policy. The website for the MCA is included in this slide. As mentioned previously, the Vibrant Future website also has maps that can be used in the growth policy. The regional plan will be a resource for trends and analysis, and will also include policies that can be incorporated into the growth policy. The Department of Commerce has a growth policy resource book that can be downloaded from their website, and growth policies from other communities. Thank you for participating in this webinar, and we invite you to view the other training webinars in the Vibrant Future series.